Well, everywhere you look these days, seems like the world's falling apart. Politically, socially, economically, environmentally. Institutions are losing trust. Nations are all over the place. And many people sense that the future is becoming more uncertain by the hour. And some people think we're entering a phase of terminal decline. Looking around, why wouldn't you? Except that what happens if there's a different story? What happens if there's a context going on that we haven't realised? Then what? What if the chaos of our time isn't the end of civilization at all, but just us, changing up a gear in a much larger cycle of history? Many ancient cultures believed that humanity moved through vast ages of rise and decline that unfolds over thousands of years. And according to that view, the turmoil of our time is just us moving out of one age and into another. And if that's true, then the confusion of our time begins to look and feel very different. And more than that, the seemingly chaotic story of humanity, well, it lights up like a pinball machine. It all starts making sense in a way that we just couldn't have imagined before. The pieces of the jigsaw fit together and we begin to see the picture. Change is good, apparently. And you can't stop it. Also seems to be the case. However, two things about this. One is that the kind of change that we're going through now is not your average change. There's change and there's change. And this is change. It's on a scale that is so big that we don't really see it. I mean, you could argue that all of the trouble in the 20th century, the world wars and everything, were all an attempt to stop this kind of change happening, the big wheel from turning. And not only did it not manage to stop the wheel turning, the wheel got faster anyway. No one has managed to stop it, and they won't now. And now there's an acceleration going on that, well, I'm not even sure if we're still on the ground. It almost feels like we're taking off. But either way, there's a momentum going on that is bringing something down that is beyond politics. And it's beyond the normal context that we would look at our lives in. It's all coming down. I think it's safe to say that it's a paradigm coming down, a whole way of thinking and being. And this conflicts with the second point, which is us as humans. We are wired to resist change at every opportunity. And what is this context? Well, many years ago, there was a film, an American caper movie, back in the days when America was good, called It's a Mad, 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 Mad World. And it's basically, a car chase, a treasure hunt across the States to the West Coast. And I always remember the closing scene, or one of the closing scenes at the end of this ridiculous journey, where the hapless seekers all converged on this one spot where the treasure was supposed to be. And it was there was a W involved in it. And we see them running around looking for this treasure. And then the camera pans out and we understand, and we can see that they're running in among these palm trees that form an enormous W. But it's so big they can't see it, and they're running around in it. And this is kind of, I think a fairly functional analogy for where we are. This context is so big that we don't see it. We're in it. We're running around it. We're looking for something. It doesn't make any sense because it's so big and we're so close up. And this is the thing. this idea of the context also contravenes our ideas of what history is. In the same way that the horizon isn't flat. Not really, is it? Not really. It's only flat because we see a little bit of it, but when you pan out enough, you go, oh, it's round. It's very, very far from flat, actually. So flatness just indicates the small scale of the perspective that we have, which is part of the beauty of the Earthrise photo. For me, anyway. You think, yeah, it's not flat. Of course, it's not flat. Nothing is flat. Sorry, what? Nothing is straight. Nature doesn't do straight. Nature doesn't do linear. Linear just means we're not seeing it all. Cycles, spirals. This seems to be what happens from pine cones to galaxies and beyond. So for us, this idea of change is part of an expanded mindset that we need to consider, where it's required, basically, because, we have a pretty Teletubby view of things. We're still not far away from thinking we're at the centre of the universe and the whole thing spins around us. And we are now, among many other things, being required, forced to expand our perception. We are getting 1,000 years education in about 50. And it hurts your brain, doesn't it? But that's what's going on. But interestingly, this is not a new idea. That the ancients knew about it. The Egyptians knew about it. The Greeks knew about it. The Mayans knew about it. Hesiod, he wrote about it in his Working Days. Plato even called it the Great Year. This enormous cycle. The Great Year. And that is an even better analogy than the palm trees. And all of this leads us to the place where they seem to have kept the knowledge over millennia and millennia, and that place is India. And even to consider that a place like India would have had knowledge of such things is to acknowledge the existence of a cycle, even before we really kind of got to grips with it. So, if you look at Indian literature or their oral traditions and the vast storehouses of great knowledge that they had no right knowing all of this stuff at the time they did, according to our mainstream linear views of history. We should have just been crawling out of our caves or whatever, being nomadic, but certainly not understanding the ways of the cosmos. But India is the place. They had very, very detailed understanding of all kinds of things, high science, that we just haven't got to yet. And this is part of that. We have not got to it yet, and there are all kinds of extraordinary and excellent reasons why we don't know. We've got our iPhones, and we've got our tech, but really, we don't know very much at all. We are still at the Teletubby stage. So there was a cycle going on, but as we will find out, that also went down the tubes. The maths went wrong, but we still hold on to those maths today. But fortunately, there was someone who came along and recalculated all of that. Enter Swami Sri Yukteswar, the great sage and seer of the 19th, early 20th century in India. We can, and we should, and we will be looking at Sri Yukteswar and his profound insights and calculations and the nature of the context around this context. But for now, we are just concerned with the idea that there is a cycle. There is a framework for human history. There is meaning, a context around the chaos of now, and there's a roadmap out of here. And isn't that what we need? Isn't that what we want to know? Isn't part of the trouble and the problem is that we don't know what's going on? Because we're so close up, we don't see the palm trees, we don't see the bigger picture. But here it is. And it's always been here, right under our noses. And now it's time to wake up and understand what's going on. That this cycle doesn't belong to anyone, doesn't belong to a religious tradition or a spiritual path or anything like that. It's going on because it's driven by the motion of the solar system through space. And that doesn't belong to anyone, not yet anyway. The sun isn't just sitting there. We're not just sitting there, are we? But representations of the solar system are often shown as this kind of 2D thing where we just go around the sun. But on the other hand, we also know that the sun's moving extremely fast through space and we're going with it in its wake, spinning as we go. But we don't put these two things together. But when you do, oh, the sun is travelling, we're going with it. Well, where's it going? Where are we going? It seems that the ancients understood that the sun describes a vast circle in space, and this in turn generates the cycle that we are talking about, the Great Year. At some point, for reasons that will become very evident, the maths went awry, and they are still in the mainstream awry, to the point where the cycle is considered to be so vast as to be not worth even bothering about because we are where we are. Sri Yukteswar recalculated and explains why those calculations went awry, why they went wrong, what went wrong about them, and presented the thing in a way that makes much more sense. And when you overlay this over history and where we are now, everything just lights up, as we said. And we can go into the whys and wherefores of that a bit later on. But for now, we are just concerned with the idea that there is a serious context, and it is driven by planetary motion, not by some woolly philosophy. And that where we are in this cycle is in a place of transition, an upward transition, that despite all appearances to the contrary, things are getting better. That we've been asleep, it's time to wake up, and, we don't want to. But, like it or not, we are. We are being dragged, kicking and screaming, into a better age, a higher age. And this is just the best news, isn't it? So for many people, politics is the frame and the guiding metrics of their lives. But what's going on is so much bigger than politics now. So much bigger. And we feel it, and it generates this existential sense of unease because we can't place it. And the tools that we got don't work anymore. And they don't work anymore because, well, they don't work. We've outgrown the past. The past is over. But there are a lot of people who are still hanging on to that past because they're invested in it in all kinds of ways. And a lot of people are hanging on to the past because they're afraid, which is understandable. But if you've got a context, that really helps. That actually something much better is up ahead. All will be well. But we are in a very unstable time of change, and therefore, down on the ground, there is work to do. There's work to be done about guiding our way forward into the future. And if this resonates with you, then it's time to get on board. And this is what this channel is, the coming dawn. The dawn is here. But what do you get before the dawn? The darkest hour. All right, pretty dark out there. And the bottom line is, last word goes to Sri Yukteswar, is that the universe does not need our opinion.